September 2nd, 31 BC. The sun rose over the Ionian Sea off the coast of western Greece, and two of the greatest military forces in the ancient world prepared to destroy each other. On one side, Octavian and his brilliant admiral Marcus Agrippa, commanding a Roman fleet that had spent months repositioning, cutting supply lines, and starving the opposition into weakness. On the other side, Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, commanding a combined Greco Egyptian fleet that on paper should have been more than capable of breaking through. What happened next has been debated by military historians for 2,000 years, and the most common explanation, that Cleopatra panicked and fled, leaving Antony no choice but to follow her, is almost certainly wrong. To understand the Battle of Actium, you have to understand what led to it. Cleopatra was not simply a passenger in this war, she was its primary financier. The fleet that faced Octavian that morning had been built largely with Egyptian gold. Egyptian shipyards had produced hundreds of heavy warships called quinqueremes, massive vessels powered by 5 banks of oars, armored for ramming combat, and carrying artillery platforms capable of launching volleys of flaming projectiles across open water. Cleopatra had personally overseen the logistics of supplying that fleet, managing the grain stores, the timber contracts, the recruitment of oarsmen, and the coordination of a supply chain that stretched from Alexandria to the Greek coast. She was not decorating the war effort. She was bankrolling and managing it with the precision of a military administrator. So, why did it fall apart so completely? The answer starts months before the battle itself. Agrippa was a tactical genius, and he understood something Antony did not seem to fully grasp. You do not have to defeat a superior fleet in open water if you can starve it first. Through a series of rapid coastal raids beginning in the spring of 31 BC, Agrippa systematically destroyed Antony and Cleopatra's supply depots along the Greek coast. Port after port fell, food stores burned, reinforcement routes were cut. By the time the combined fleet was anchored in the Gulf of Ambracia near Actium, they were already in serious trouble. Disease had swept through the camps. Desertion was rising. Several of Antony's allied kings had already switched sides. The fleet that faced Octavian on September 2nd was not the force it had been 6 months earlier. It was hungry, undermanned, and operating in waters controlled by an enemy who had spent the entire summer dictating the terms of engagement. Antony and Cleopatra faced a brutal choice: fight their way out through Agrippa's blockade or surrender and accept whatever terms Octavian would offer. They chose to fight. And here's where the historical record becomes genuinely contested. Ancient sources friendly to Octavian, which is most of the sources that survived, describe what happened next as a catastrophic betrayal. Cleopatra, they claim, panicked midway through the battle, turned her squadron of 60 Egyptian ships around, and fled south toward Egypt. Antony, mad with love or weak with obsession depending on which Roman poet you prefer, abandoned his own flagship and chased after her, leaving his forces leaderless in the middle of a battle they were already losing. This is the story that won. But military historians examining the tactical evidence have raised serious doubts about it. Cleopatra's squadron did break from the main engagement and sail south. That part is documented, but the timing, the direction, and the fact that her ships had their sails rigged and ready before the battle even reached its peak suggests something different from panic. Sails were not used in ancient naval combat. They were too slow to maneuver, too vulnerable to fire, and useless in the close quarters ramming engagements that defined ancient sea battles. The only reason to have sails raised and ready during a fleet action is if you are planning to make a long open water voyage immediately afterward, which means Cleopatra's departure was not a panicked retreat. It was a planned breakout. The most credible modern interpretation is that Antony and Cleopatra had already recognized before the battle began that they could not win a naval engagement against Agrippa in those waters under those conditions. The goal was never to defeat the Roman fleet outright. The goal was to break through Agrippa's line with enough ships and enough resources to reach Egypt, regroup, and continue the war from a position of supply and home advantage. Cleopatra's squadron carried the war treasury. She was not running from the battle. She was preserving the assets necessary to fight the next one. Antony's decision to follow her was not weakness. It was the only move that made strategic sense if the breakout plan was to have any chance of succeeding. What went wrong was everything that came after. The remaining fleet, leaderless and already battered, surrendered to Octavian within days. Antony's land legions, waiting on shore for orders that never came, held out for a week before they too capitulated. By the time Cleopatra and Antony reached Alexandria, they had lost not just the battle, but the alliance structure that had held their entire campaign together. Client kings defected, Roman officers surrendered. The Eastern Mediterranean realigned almost overnight toward the new power in Rome. Octavian arrived in Alexandria less than a year later. Antony died by his own hand. Cleopatra, rather than be paraded through Rome as a trophy in Octavian's triumph, chose death on her own terms. The Asp story is almost certainly Roman embellishment. Toxicologists and classicists have argued for decades that a mixture of poisons, the very compounds she had spent years studying in her private laboratory, is a far more plausible explanation for the manner and speed of her death. Even in dying, she was more in control than Rome wanted to admit. The Battle of Actium did not prove that Cleopatra was weak. It proved that she was operating without margins. When Agrippa destroyed her supply lines, he did not just damage her fleet. He dismantled the logistical foundation that her entire strategic advantage was built on. She was a ruler who had built her power on economic depth, on grain reserves and trade networks and treasury surpluses that could outlast almost any military opponent. Take away the supply chain and you take away the war. Agrippa knew that, and it is the part of the story that almost no one tells. Because the story Rome preferred was simpler. A woman panicked. A great man followed her. An empire was lost. 2,000 years later, most people still believe that version. If you think she deserved a more honest history, drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story you had never heard before. And follow Cleopatra Unfiltered because the real military history of the ancient world's greatest queen is only just starting to be told correctly.